Good afternoon, or maybe good evening or morning. I don't know, wherever you happen to be. I'm Bob McConnell, co-founder of the U.S. Ukraine Foundation, and welcome to today's discussion. Security guarantees. Can Ukraine depend upon them? Based on reports from ongoing bifurcated quote unquote negotiations, with U.S. negotiating with Russia, U.S. negotiating with Ukraine, U.S. negotiators multiple trips to Moscow and no trips to Kiev, U.S. negotiating with Europe, Ukraine negotiating with Europe. The subject of security guarantees seems to come up throughout the mix, whoever's talking to whoever. Yet when it seems there is a beginning to some meeting of minds between the US, Europe, and Ukraine, there is a shot from Moscow that this is not going to be acceptable. Add to this Russia's at-will history, a violent history as well. It would seem that Ukraine's government and the people of Ukraine should have significant concern relating to anything they might be promised. To discuss all this, we have a wonderful panel today, and all of you who follow the U.S. Ukraine's Friends of Ukraine network, these names should be familiar, the faces should be familiar because everyone should be well known therefore introduction should be brief. Ambassador John Herbst is the leader of Atlantic Council Eurasia Center and former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. John also chairs the Friends of Ukraine Network Task Force on National Security, which all of today's panelists are members. General Phil Breedlove, United States Air Force retired. Among other things, Phil is a four-star general and former Supreme Allied Commander Europe. Ian Brzezinski, among other things, Ian is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO policy. Ambassador Alexander Vershbow, former United States Ambassador to Russia, former Ambassador to NATO, and former Deputy Secretary General of NATO. Do know that you can ask questions in the chat room. I'll try and get to them. I'll try and see them and get to them, but I'm sure I may not be able to get to everyone. Please understand. So let's get the discussion started. Phil, you're the military expert here today, and you have been following the security guarantee discussion for months. Do you see the security measures being discussed as promising, not just something to achieve a stoppage in current fighting, but something capable of securing Ukraine's future?
Well, first of all, thanks. And it's great to be alongside of the people I respect so much today and have worked so long with and for. So, a good panel. I think before I answer your question, I think it's important to highlight something that you said, and that is, are these going to be acceptable, and will they accomplish and I'm going to add words to yours now, a just and durable peace. What we don't want is a stutter stop, a ceasefire that just allows the sides to regroup and refurb and get further ready, et cetera, et cetera. What we want to get to is a just and a durable peace, and that's going to take a lot more than just a couple of signatures on a piece of paper. The words that are bantered around a lot today, that as the only one I really want to address, is this Article 5 like guarantee. And I think that what worries me about that phrasing is that there's a lot more of trying to latch onto something that is durable, meaning a NATO Article 5, but not have the NATO part of it. So any sort of agreement that would be quote unquote Article 5 like would be very much dependent on who is in the coalition of guarantors that says we are going to treat this in an Article 5 fashion. Which leads me to my biggest concern about the whole process, which is the whole idea of coming to a ceasefire and trying to find, as I said before, a just and durable end to this conflict is going to very much depend on who is in the mix. What nations are a part of the guarantor list? What nations are making statements that they will be a part of an quote unquote Article 5 like defense? At least one of my panelists will be angry at the way I categorize it. We have an example of an immense failure in this kind of agreement in the Budapest Memorandum of 94, where our nation, the United Kingdom, Ukraine, and Russia came to a quote unquote agreement. It was not a treaty in the United States, but an agreement whereby the nations would assure Ukraine of its sovereignty and of its sovereign borders. And two of those nations, of course, the United States and the UK, are big and powerful and capable NATO nations. And if I was grading our paper as a professor of this particular class, I would give us an F minus in our performance of the assurances that we made in 1994. The current administration, our current president, for 4 years had a situation where Russians were occupying portions of Ukraine, and we have done nothing about it. In fact, literally, we have failed at assuring sovereignty and sovereign borders for the past 12 years since the winter of late 13, early 14, when all of this started. So I've gone a little too long, but the bottom line is any agreement should not be aimed at the immediate. It should be for a durable and lasting peace. And any agreement is going to have a robust list of guarantors. And we in the United States and the United Kingdom, and certainly the aggressors in this war, the Russians, have almost zero credibility going into this deliberation, as I see it, based on our failure to perform to the 1994 agreement. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Phil. Sandy, it seems to me you come to these discussions with a unique perspective. Among them being ambassador to Russia and Deputy General Secretary of NATO and ambassador to NATO. You've been dealing with Russians up close for quite some time, and you've got to have ideas about what's needed to guarantee anything when the Russians are involved. Your thoughts?
Well, that's a kind of an open-ended question, but I think the shorter answer is don't trust them for a second. I think one problem in handling the whole Ukraine crisis going back to 2014 or even earlier has been this inability of our allies and inability of the United States to fully see today's Russia for what it is. Because it wasn't always as bad as it is now. I was ambassador in the early Putin days, and we thought we were able to do business with him. We signed the agreement on the NATO-Russia Council, and for a while we had some sort of a modest cooperation going on with Russia. But clearly that Russia is long gone and not likely to return, at least in my lifetime, unless some of the rumors about Putin's shakier political foundations prove to be true. But I'm not predicting that. But I think that this issue of security guarantees is especially difficult because of the bad experience of the Budapest Memorandum. There's no question about that. So I think that if these negotiations that have been going on ever actually produce even a ceasefire, much less a broader agreement, there will have to be a whole network of different kinds of security guarantees that could, together, if robust enough, provide assurance that the Russians will be incapable or sufficiently deterred from invading Ukraine again. I think that has to be still the sort of the benchmark that we work against. Do we have a series of steps that together either will prevent or at least deter effectively the Russians from doing this again? I think the talks that took place in the context of the last NATO summit never really got into the heart of this issue. So there's space to do that if there's even a slim chance that the agreements will be reached and will last. But at the moment, it looks like what we thought was too good to be true was in fact too good to be true. The signals coming out of the negotiations regarding security guarantees and the NATO Article 5 like security guarantees, all these words sounded good, but whether they would be implementable with confidence remains to be seen. And at the moment, it looks like Putin is simply repeating his position that his maximalist positions are unchanged, and implicitly he's saying, "I've been leading President Trump along all this time, but try to keep the ball in our court while keeping the war going for the indefinite future."
Well, thank you, Sandy. Ian, you've been focused on European and NATO defense policies for a long time, and those policies had to do with defense against Russia. I'm sure you've got additional thoughts for what's been said so far. I'd like to hear.
Well, Bob, thank you for including me in such an august panel. It's humbling to be among these colleagues. Let me make a couple of points about the kind of context of the negotiations, because I think they relate to what the requirements of a deterrent force are going to be or are. First, I want to just capture a thought that General Breedlove made about the credibility of the West when it comes to defending its vital interests. Over the last decade, that credibility has been significantly weakened by the West's failure to robustly support Ukraine. So Putin is now more confident in his ability to use military force to deter intervention by NATO, by allied member states. So that raises the threshold of requirements for an effective deterrent force. Second, right now the negotiations are very much geared towards achieving a ceasefire. And I'm doubtful that ceasefire is going to come anytime soon, in part because of what Sandy said. Putin is showing no interest in peace. He's refusing to budge from his core demands and objectives. He's continuing to pummel Ukraine's front lines, its cities and its towns, doing so relentlessly, ruthlessly, trying to break Ukraine's morale by attacking its civilians. Putin doesn't want peace. He wants Ukraine, and he's confident he can achieve that goal. So in my view, there are only two things that will bring Putin to a ceasefire. The first and most optimal is a change in the correlation of forces, to use a Soviet phrase, that would threaten Putin's territorial gains in Ukraine, threaten what he's achieved in seizing Ukrainian territory. And I'm convinced the moment he is at risk of losing any of that territory, Putin's going to be the first coming to the negotiating table for a ceasefire. The second driver is one of real immediate concern for me, because the second driver of what would bring Putin to a ceasefire is an agreement that positions him to later achieve his objective, complete control of Ukraine. So What I've been hearing over the last couple of weeks is really concerning. I'm concerned about Western, particularly U.S., pressure on Ukraine toward an agreement that would, one, give more force Ukraine to give up territory to Russia, reward Russia by giving up Ukrainian territory that Ukraine currently controls, territory that includes strategically important defenses for Ukraine. Second, we're pressuring Ukraine to accept a ceiling on the size of its military. With 600,000, 800,000. Why is it that we're putting a cap on the victim's military? A cap on a country that's a third of the size of Russia? It's stunning to me. We're demanding new elections in Ukraine. That's a recipe for injecting political instability, and we know what the Russians will do. They'll be pouring disinformation and provocateurs into Ukraine to turn such elections towards what Putin wants. We're forcing Ukraine to refuse allied forces on its territory. That's a diminution of sovereignty. We're asking Ukraine to dilute and transform its relationship with NATO, give up its ambition for membership, which, by the way, when you do that, you're pushing the alliance to basically treat Ukraine not as a vital interest, but just as a geographic neighbor. And we're precluding NATO to be part of the security guarantees, which basically removes NATO from the most important security challenge to the transatlantic community since the end of the Cold War. That diminishes NATO's role in transatlantic security. And we've even flirted with the idea of forcing the Ukrainians to accept a Russian role in Ukraine's reconstruction. All of this would increase Ukraine's vulnerability by diminishing its sovereignty, diminishing its military, upsetting its political unity, and diminishing its international relationships. That is the kind of outcome Putin would be happy to accept. That is the kind of outcome that will make it much more difficult to deter future Russian aggression. So one more point, because I wanted to build on General Breedlove's concerns about the phrase NATO-like security guarantees, because it's not clear to me what they mean by that. NATO security guarantees were indeed remarkably successful during the Cold War. They prevented an invasion through the Fulda Gap. Even more remarkably, they prevented the seizure by the Soviets, by the Warsaw Pact, of West Berlin, a tiny NATO outpost in East Germany. Hundreds of thousands of Allied troops, including divisions of US forces, guarded NATO's eastern frontier. And in West Berlin was deployed, West Berlin was guarded by a multinational on-site NATO presence that, by the way, included the US Berlin Brigade of about 6,000 or so troops. And believe me, that's what Putin remembers, because he was a young agent in the time of the Cold War, rising up in the ranks of the KGB. He knows that. So security guarantees that are not backed by robust in-country force are no more than paper and rhetoric. They would ignore the lessons to be found in NATO's success, and that were clearly ignored by, I think it was Phil who said, by those who pressured Ukraine into signing the Budapest Agreement of 1994, an agreement that we now know why Russia so readily accepted. Presence in Ukraine, a deterrent force in Ukraine, has to be combat capable. And I'm hearing talk about, we'll have training elements in Western Ukraine. Well, let's not forget that Allied training elements were previously in Western Ukraine. And when things got hot over there, they were withdrawn, not reinforced. They were withdrawn when Russia looked ready to invade Ukraine. Putin certainly remembers that. So when we talk about NATO-like security guarantees, let's just keep in mind the following. One, unless they involve a robust military capability on the ground in Ukraine, they are not NATO-like. Second, unless they involve a U.S. military presence in Ukraine, they are not NATO-like. Now that some may say, well, Ian, that's a hard political order. It is a hard political order, and I worry the consensus isn't there for that. But let's be clear. The alliance has the capacity, the United States has the capacity to meet those requirements. It's not a matter of capability. It's a matter of political will.
Well, thank you, Ian. You've laid it out pretty clearly. John, as often as is the case, I come to you as the cleanup hitter. You, you're covering all aspects of what's going on in the talks and everything else, and you're on many webinars and interviews and panels and so forth. You've heard what our colleagues have had to say about the negotiations. Please share your thoughts.
Look, everything they've said, literally everything they've said, has been not just correct, but very smart. Uh, Trump continues to say that he wants to achieve a durable peace. That goal is eminently reachable. It's not a just peace because it's the whole concept, which goes back to his team during his election campaign uh, before he was reelected, says essentially the fighting stops along the current lines of the two contending forces. But that's not enough for Putin because a durable peace means Ukraine gets to exist as a sovereign, independent country, an economically viable country, a secure country. And that's not Putin's aim. Putin's aim is to have what I call effective political control of the country. And that requires him to control pretty much the entire left bank of the Dnipro River, which is hundreds of miles from the front in the east. That requires him to have the entire Black Sea coast of Ukraine. And maybe Ukraine could exist as 1/4 or 1/5 the size of its current size, landlocked with few economic prospects and maybe some security, but again, for a tiny portion of territory and tiny portion of its population. And that's not the stable peace that's Trump's goal. Now, the Trump team, the Trump administration laid out, again, before the inauguration, and even since, the basic way to achieve a durable peace, which is you put reasonable proposals on the table, and if the sides reject them or one side rejects them, then you impose serious pressure on that one side, or both sides, as the case may be. And if we're talking about Ukraine, sadly, we saw the imposition of serious pressure after the infamous Oval Office meeting on February 28, when, whether at Trump's instructions or not only was the supply of military equipment to Ukraine approved by Congress in 2024 halted, but so was military intelligence. And that cutoff of military intelligence for a week or 10 days led to the largest gains the Russians have achieved since their big invasion went south in March or April of 2022. On the other side of the ledger, because not once did Zelensky say no to Trump proposals before that step was taken or after. And after that step was taken, the administration put in play 5 or 6 proposals. Zelensky accepted every single proposal. The Russians accepted none. 0, zip. And so we had a period, literally it lasted from early May until late October or early November, where there was talk from the administration of putting pressure on the Kremlin, both by selling more advanced weapons to Europe to send to Ukraine, including in the last of that phase, starting sometime in middle of September, sending Tomahawks, longish range American missiles can go 1,500 to 2,000 kilometers, and also talk about major sanctions. Now, the larger weapons flow never happened. It is true that Trump put serious sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, Russia's largest oil firms, in late-ish October. But it's at that point when the pressure on Russia ceased. It was not a coincidence, as they used to say in the Soviet Union, comrade, that literally the day after those sanctions were imposed, Putin dispatched Kirill Dmitriev, one of the Harvard brothers, to meet with Witkoff, another of the Harvard brothers. And from there, we got some very bad proposals for an administration whose stated goal is a durable peace. Proposals that included, the handing over to Russia of heavily fortified Western Donbass, which in almost 4 years since the Russian big invasion, the Russians have been unable to capture. Territory which guards the entire, or nearly the entire, left bank of Ukraine, all the way to the Dnipro River. We got the obtuse idea of limiting the military of the victim state, Ukraine, and not the aggressor state, Russia. And we got my personal favorite, because I'm always interested in bizarre proposals, the concept that of the nearly $300 billion worth of frozen Russian state assets currently in the international financial system, Ukraine gets $100 billion, and the remainder, the majority, is split between the United States and Russia for joint investment. So these were clearly proposals that were extremely friendly to the Kremlin. And these are all dangerous ideas which cut hard against American interest. Now, this panel is about security guarantees. And the reason for that is that the Trump administration, after wanting no conversation about security guarantees whatsoever, and if you remember, Zelensky's insistence on security guarantees in the Oval Office on February 28 was one of the reasons why that meeting fast deteriorated. Well, the administration decided, to persuade Zelensky to give up Western Donbass, maybe we, the U.S., need to provide security guarantees. And I welcome that. Welcome that concept. And of course, it was in the Oval Office meeting with the 7 European leaders 3 days after the failed Alaska summit that the concept of NATO Article 5-like security guarantees was put in play. But as especially Phil, but also Sandy and Ian pointed out, we don't really know what those security guarantees are. And we've seen no clear evidence that they would in fact work for various reasons. I don't dismiss them despite that, although I agree with their comments, because I take Chancellor Merz seriously, and he's saying there's something there that the United States has given. Well, maybe that's true. Maybe that's a tactical statement for reasons that especially Sandy and I could go through, having spent many years as diplomats. But let's take a look before we decide. But one final point, which has not really entered the debate, although I've tried to insert it. The concept of putting together the handover to Ukraine of strategic territory in Western Donbass at the same time that the UN guarantees Ukraine's security puts Americans' military at unnecessary risk. Why would we want to hand Russian prime strategic territory if we're going to have to stop them? So it's really quite an amazing thing if you think about it. Now, I think we should make sure Ukraine retains that territory and give them the security guarantees to make it really impossible for Russia to move. But we're not seeing that level, which is not a very high level, of geopolitical sophistication amongst the negotiators for the United States. And frankly, last point, because I remain in the minority of analysts who think that ultimately Trump is not going to pressure Zelensky to give away the store, because that means he will not achieve a durable peace, and he will look like an historic putz, Putin's putz. And there's no doubt that the negotiations that began when Driscoll went to Kiev carrying the Witkoff-Dmitriev plan, did not have Trump's full buy-in or endorsement. But he has let this process continue, albeit stepping back from insisting on deadlines that made no sense and not fully going after Ukraine's leadership to force them to do that. And most people might disagree with what I've just said, so let me explain it. Everyone quotes, understandably, what President Trump said 2 Sundays ago. Was it 2 Sundays? Yes, 2 Sundays ago. That he was angry because Zelensky had not read the American proposal, which Zelensky's negotiators loved. And of course, his negotiators put out a statement distancing themselves from that concept. And that was the headline, understandably. But what Trump also said, kind of parenthetically, in that same statement, he said, Putin, I think, will go for this, although I actually think he wants all of Ukraine. So he himself was basically saying, well, maybe this is not such a great idea, although he didn't say it that way. Okay, I think I've said enough mischievous things.
Well, instead of inserting myself here, other panelists, Phil, Sandy, Ian, John set out a lot of things to talk about. Phil?
Well, and I've been reading ahead a little bit, Bob, in the questions, so maybe I might tie one of those in as well. There is at least an attempt out there to understand what would make an agreement durable. And of course, Mr. Putin has laid out what he thinks makes it durable, and that is no NATO in Ukraine and a buffer zone that is donated by Ukraine, not by Russia. And so that's why, I felt like we also needed to talk about what is an equitable or a responsible kind of an agreement, because it can't be all of Ukraine giving up the concessions. And I joined 2 of our speakers who've sort of alluded to the fact that, we have an aggressor who is giving up and being asked to give up essentially nothing. And we have the aggrieved that is being pressured and forced to give everything up. And my response to all of that is, what happened to peace through strength? It would sure be nice if our nation that is now running on peace through strength would look at the aggressor and say, you will make the following concessions. Not ask, not go hat in hand, but say, these are the concessions you will make, and then start the conversation. But we don't seem to ever get to that point. It's always, Russia's too hard to deal with, force Ukraine to make concessions. And we have to get past that. I think part of this is, and I you know me, I don't do politics. So I'm trying not to be a politician in this following statement. But we have businessmen going over to make negotiations about geopolitical security. The two are a bad mismatch. This is not a business deal going on in Russia. This is a geostrategic security arrangement, and we need the right people doing that. We have exactly the wrong people doing that. Over.
Well, I liked everything you said, but that last point I think is so very important. We have real estate brokers over there trying to solve a strategic war. Seems like a total mismatch, especially when I'm looking at my screen and I see 2 wonderful and experienced diplomats, and we're not using any such people in this whole thing. Sandy, your thoughts on where we are now?
Well, the problem is we're all car-carrying members of the deep state, so likelihood of our being employed by this administration, even if we wanted to, which we probably don't, is not going to arise. But I agree with what Phil has said. Leaving aside security guarantees from it, the whole issue here is whether the victim of aggression is going to achieve any justice from this process, or is it all just a facade for business deals, rare earths, and all these other things that the Russians are dangling in front of Witkoff and company? But the other thing is that there's a lot of specific issues that still are unresolved in terms of any kind of package of security guarantees. I mean, what is the legally binding? What is that actually going to mean in practice? The renunciation of NATO membership by Ukraine, which I deeply regret, because NATO does have a policy. Doesn't mean they're going to get admitted the day after tomorrow, but leaving that aside, is Ukraine going to get anything tangible in return for this major concession? Or is it just going to be one Ukrainian concession after another? I think that there's a lot of things that can be done to build up the security assistance side of security guarantees, sort of to make them this undigestible porcupine, to bolster rapid reaction capabilities so that we could actually carry out an Article 5 type of commitment to reinforce Ukraine or other victims of aggression before we were confronted with fait accompli. So there's a lot of details that need to be addressed, but I don't get the sense that anybody on the administration side is looking into these very, very, very carefully. But it all may be academic, because President Putin has rejected the latest version of the deal. But at some point, there's going to be something that looks at least superficially more negotiable. And have we done enough of our homework for fleshing out the security guarantee subject sufficiently? I don't think we have.
Well, I have to agree with you. I mean, you have sentences, whether it's Article 5 like and so forth. I mean, all that is, there are details that are absolutely critical. And there's one of the things about, I'll throw this out, I don't know that you can have, in this context, a treaty. But one of the things that people used on the Budapest Memorandum to excuse our misbehavior under that agreement was, well, it wasn't a treaty, it was just an agreement. I mean, if there's a way, whatever this ends up being, to be put in the form of a treaty, so the United States Senate has to approve it and so forth, that'd give me a little bit more faith, because it'd get flushed out by a lot more people and so forth. But Ian,
Bob,
you're listening.
Now, just to follow up on your point, even if it's ratified by the U.S. Senate, it means nothing unless you have forces on the ground.
Right.
That is NATO-like. Otherwise, it's a piece of paper. But let me hit three concepts very quickly. Justice, sovereignty, and peace, I think, have to be addressed. As Phil and my colleagues have been saying, right now we're not addressing justice issues. You do not have justice if the Russians get to walk away with the territory. You do not have justice if Russia gets to walk away with any accountability for its atrocities it's committed. You do not have justice if you have a peace in which Ukraine is left on its own without any Russian reparations. That's not justice. Justice is important to deterrence, because when you impose justice and get justice and you punish the aggressors, that disincentivizes the aggressor to try again, and it disincentivizes other aggressors to pursue their ambitions. Sovereignty. When you force on Ukraine neutrality, which is what we are doing right now, you are not getting neutrality, you're getting subordination. and you're basically allowing Russia to suborn Ukraine. That is not good for deterrence because it rewards Russia. And when you allow Russia to suborn a neighbor, it increases Russia's proclivity to further suborn, to further, conduct aggression against that neighbor. So what they're doing is a violation of sovereignty and a reward to Putin that will ultimately incentivize Putin to continue his quest to completely control Ukraine. And then peace. Listening to this conversation, I get worried about the way we use the word peace. We are not going to have peace with Putin. We may have a ceasefire. We may have military stability, and that's what should be our objectives. But as long as Putin's around, we're not going to have peace. And when we use the phrase peace, we're kind of almost inferring, we're misguiding ourselves because we're projecting upon Putin our belief that he wants peace, and he doesn't. He wants Ukraine. And we have to remember that, because if we don't, we're not going to configure our deterrent force in the proper way.
Ian, I absolutely agree with you, and I think you've said it in a different way and maybe a better way. But over the course of all this, it just seems like what we think should be done and what we fight for is sliding to a lower level than it needs to be. And I'm concerned, whether it's Witkoff and anybody else, whether the people involved really understand or appreciate who they're dealing with. I mean, you said Putin doesn't want peace. There's no indication he wants peace. He has, among other things, 1.8 million young people in Russia Youth Army training for the future. What is he doing with the abducted children from Ukraine? They're being militarized. In the occupied territories, there are 1.6 million Ukrainian children. Are they all going to be part of an army that's being prepared to continue to fight as long as Russia is not stopped? I don't see our people understanding that we have a belligerent that is committed to belligerence. But that's just me. John?
We've covered a great deal of ground and made the essential points. Again, Putin, even as Trump acknowledged parenthetically when he was criticizing Zelensky, wants to have control of Ukraine. And the only way he stops is if he is stopped. And Ukraine has shown a great ability to stop him if Ukraine gets the economic aid to sustain its economy and the weapons, although they're devising their own weapons, they still need the most advanced weapons or many of the advanced weapons that we have to do the job. And Trump's goal of not a just peace, a durable peace, is achievable without us losing one American soldier, and maybe without us even providing additional aid as opposed to American help in the form of sales of equipment and military intelligence. But we have to recognize the problem for what it is. And you would think that the administration would know, having had Putin reject half a dozen of its proposals, that he is in fact the problem needs to be dealt with. And the way to get him to make the right decisions, meaning to make a durable peace, is to make it impossible to win. But there seems to be a concept that if we give concessions to Russia, Russia will offer concessions back. That's not Putin's way. You offer concessions, he pockets them, and he asks for more. And that's the basic trade-off. So there's some irony in the statements coming from senior administration officials that great progress has been made towards peace. I think all we can say is that progress has been made towards reducing the differences between the U.S. and the Ukrainian and the U.S. and the European approaches to peace. Because what we've seen on the Russian side over the past week plus is even greater belligerence. Ushakov said last Friday, well, given I haven't seen the current state of the new proposals coming from the Americans and the Ukrainians and the Europeans, but from what I hear, I think we're going to say no. Then you have Putin, as Sandy pointed out, uttering his maximalist demands publicly, whereas before he didn't want to quite put those demands in Trump's face. And then, of course, kind of most candid of all, you have the Russian ambassador in London, Kellen, saying there's no deal on the table. The only deal on the table is Ukrainian surrender. All of these hardline statements comes from the fact the Russians think that Trump is in the process of letting them have their way. And while, again, as I already said, I don't think Trump can ultimately do that and will not ultimately do that. Some of the people speaking for him in those closed rooms are greatly hinting that that is possible. And so that's a serious problem, a very serious problem.
I mean, before I go to anybody else, I have to say, John, one of the quotes from this that I'm going to remember is that if Trump doesn't come out successfully in this, he's going to be seen as Putin's putz. I mean, that's from a diplomat. Anyway, Phil, it seems to me we've also, quote unquote, accepting the practicalities of the situation. We, the West, have given up on the idea of defeating Russia. Bad thing from my standpoint. But you were in Europe a lot lately. Sandy been in Europe. John's been in Europe. How are the Europeans stepping up now? I mean, we read things. We also read about bickering between them, but it seems to me there is some progress being made by Europeans in trying to support Ukraine. What did you see on your trip?
Well, I would label this a good news, bad news story. The good news is there are some things happening. Some of the nations are beginning to make good, maybe not yet significant, but good contributions, and there are some things happening. But I'll just give you my Phil Breedlove, Georgia boy opinion of what's going on here. We got the United States sitting back saying, we're waiting for the Europeans to do something. And the Europeans are sitting back waiting on what is America going to do and what back cover are they going to give us. And so right now we are all together admiring the problem versus attempting to correct the problem. And so I think what is needed is also another answer to one of the questions in the queue, and that is, we both, the United States and Europe, we need to step up the supply to Ukraine of the things that they need to carry on this fight. We have a bad habit in America of making these big news splashes about we're going to give them Tomahawks, and then we never give them Tomahawks. Or, we're going to give them F-16s. How many U.S. F-16s have we given Ukraine? 0. NATO has given Ukraine F-16s, and the United States has given 0 F-16s. And so we need to do more than talk about it. We need to do a little bit of it. And we need to get out there and do that. May I also say that, and I've answered this question many times, but the first thing we need to give them is not a piece of equipment. The first thing we need to give them is the authority and the encouragement to use all the weapons that we in the West have given them so that they can use them to maximum effect. We keep the shackles on still most of the kit that we give to Ukraine. We limit them so that there's not too much impact to Russia. and I'll leave you to determine why we're doing that. I have my own opinion. And the bottom line is what they need first and foremost is to take the shackles off and let them fight the war that they need to fight. I asked a young man who was giving me a real hard time about this 2 days ago. How many missiles has Russia fired into Kiev? Okay, that's a huge number. That is a huge number. Imagine what would be happening if Ukraine had fired the same number of weapons into Moscow. Over.
Sandy, any comment on that? I mean, from your experience in NATO, I ask, I guess, sort of the same question to Phil, but the members of NATO, are they stepping up, or are the divisions holding everything back?
Yeah. Well, no, I think to use the point made by, I think, by Phil a few seconds ago, that we're each waiting for the other. I think that's not true anymore. I think the Europeans have given up on the U.S. and we're now, if we're smart, going to remedy that problem. But at a minimum, we have to at least provide some of the weapons that the Ukrainians desperately need. That the Europeans will pay for and then give them to the Ukrainians. It's kind of embarrassing as a superpower that we're laundering our money through our allies. The challenge in Ukraine is strategically important enough that we should be contributing directly. But at least the Europeans, after many years of being criticized and hectored, are stepping up. But that's going to take them several years to really have the kinds of capabilities and the stockpiles of weapons that would enable them to carry out a big operation without much U.S. support. So hopefully we can patch up some of the strains in transatlantic relations. The Europeans, I think, are ready to do more if we ask them for it and if we give them a little credit for it at the same time.
Yeah, well, it seems to me that, the administration told Europe, you're on your own, take care of this yourselves. And then they have a meeting and start doing it, and then we criticize them for not including us in the meeting. I mean, it just seems like chaos on our side of the thing. Ian?
Bob, a good example of that is what's happening right now in Brussels. There's a big EU summit going on. They're trying to decide whether or not they'll be able to leverage the seized Russian assets to provide Ukraine much needed, urgent needed financial assistance. And they're going forward trying to do that. And we have the administration actually pushing back against that. That sends a terrible signal to the Europeans, sends a terrible signal to the Ukrainians. The only people who regard this as a positive move is Russia. Mm-hmm. But here the Europeans are trying to do more, and we're getting in their way.
One of the comments or questions in our thing, Phil's referred to several, and I'm glad he has done that, raises something that I heard the other night. The question of the anti-Ukraine members in Europe, Orban and so forth. What's behind that? And the question was asked, and the Ukrainian official said, was reluctant to go into who their biggest problems were in Europe, but for making the comment, Orban is not the worst. You guys know a lot more about Europe than I do. Who are the biggest trouble in the European community?
I'm not totally up to speed on the many of the personalities, but Orban is definitely a real problem. Slovakia, not quite as contentious on issues where they have the ability to use their veto on some EU votes. But I think the Allies are actually, much more globally conscious of the threats that the transatlantic community faces, and we should be building up that relationship, developing a kind of longer-term division of labor where we could get the Europeans to do more to pursue our priorities if we're prepared to scratch their backs a little bit more than we do now. But I think the Germans are the big positive story in terms of what they're doing in terms of defense procurement and political leadership. The Brits seem to be less and less visible, but hopefully they'll get back in the game as well in terms of broadening the coalition of support for Ukraine.
The problem with the Europeans is, I agree that the Hungarians and to a certain degree the Slovaks and can be a thorn, but if there was strong and decisive leadership and commitment and self-confidence upon a core group of Europeans, the French, the Germans, some of the Nordics, the UK, they would have the capacity to exercise their power with greater decisiveness. I think the real problem is, for the first time in 8 decades, they're sort of on their own, and they're struggling with the reality. They may have to take on a major nuclear power without the confidence of having the United States backing them. That, I think, is the biggest source of hesitation. And there are signs they're beginning to recognize this is their hour. They can't drop the ball like they did in the Balkans in '94 because so much more is at stake. And they're beginning to recognize if they leverage their power decisively, well, there's a good chance actually the United States will back them up even under Trump. Because if they leverage their power decisively, they'll put Ukraine onto a winning path, because Russia can't handle a decisive Europe and Ukraine together. But we got a ways to go before that, and it's reflected in their hesitancy to kind of really ramp up economic sanctions on Russia. It's their hesitancy to kind of really directly confront Trump with the misguided guidance he's getting from his advisors. So this is a little bit part of a learning curve and the difficulty of kind of being on their own for the first time.
John, we're getting toward the end. I had you wrap up at the beginning. I'll have you say a few words, then we'll do a fast round to close the day.
I may slightly disagree with some of the things said. And I spent 31 years in the State Department, and my goodness, 15 years since, watching closely the global scene, especially in Europe and Eurasia. And I've always been underwhelmed by Europe's performance, although I'm speaking generally, not about every single European country. And I think as they've confronted the quirkiness of administration policy over the past 10 months, I think Europe has done a credible job standing up. Now, that doesn't mean they shouldn't do more and couldn't do more. Of course they can. But I can understand why they got out of the business of projecting power on their own with the end of World War II. And they've relied upon us. And, we saw a great example of the problems that flow from that when a French general said about a month ago, Europe needs to understand that we may have to commit our troops and our soldiers are going to die. And that created a big political fuss in Paris, and he had to back off a little bit. So they are doing, I'd say, a credible job stepping up to the moment, but maybe still not ultimately enough. Having said that, maybe by this time tomorrow, we'll have good news on the frozen Russian assets, and that will be a huge step forward by the Europeans, demonstrating some real spine and some real statesmanship. The Belgians are having a conniption given the threats that are being levied on them. And I'm not talking about just the financial threats and the legal threats, but, GRU's active, talking about providing the ultimate measure of vengeance on the head of Euroclear and on the Belgian prime minister. As one of my colleagues said very smartly, well, the Belgians are beginning to feel what the Poles and the Romanians and the Balts have been feeling ever since the Soviet Union fell apart. So welcome to the real world, the real Russia world. So the reason why we're talking about European inadequacies right now is because the questions we have about Washington. And I don't say that happily. That's not a good thing for us.
A lightning round. Phil.
I think we need the American people to be more vocal. As I understand polling, there's an awful lot of Americans who believe in what NATO is, and there's an awful lot of Americans that don't see Mr. Putin as the good guy. And what we need then is for our government, our administration, to understand where the American people are and then maybe take a different tact.
Andy.
Certainly agree with that. I think that public outreach may be important at a time when we see the administration's authority over the MAGA caucus is beginning to get shaky. There may be ways to get the public in advance of the midterms, but longer term as well, to think about our responsibilities in the world the way that many of them do. The MAGA people may not want to hear that message, but if we don't fully exercise our responsibility, even the Europeans stepping up is not going to make a fundamental difference.
Ian.
Get back to our core discussions, security guarantees. In order for them to be credible, they have to be robust. They have to be on the ground. They have to include an American dimension on the ground. And we need to be careful not to allow the other elements of a ceasefire agreement undermine the effectiveness of that deterrent force, to make the deterrent challenge even more difficult. That's what I'm watching.
I would simply conclude by saying I don't think we will wind up seeing a ceasefire, perhaps along any lines, but certainly not along the lines of the proposals that concern all of us, that worry all of us. As long as Putin thinks that we will continue to make concessions, he'll reject even more favorable friendly proposals than the ones we have in play right now, because he'll want more. And again, at a certain point, the American people don't want the United States to be the dinghy in the wake of the Russian man of war, which is what some people are seeing right now.
Well, thank you. I think, the point about our government understanding where the public is, the public needs to be louder, but the polls are showing an increased support for Ukraine and an increased distaste for Putin. It's like the American public is seeing what our government isn't seeing. And I would add that Congress, my criticism is that on this subject, the United States Congress has not acted like an independent, co-equal branch of government, and it needs to do so. There are more members starting to speak up, starting to do things that are appropriate. There needs to be much more. They've been living in fear of pushback from President Trump for too long. They need to be looking at the national interest, and the defense authorization bill, NDAA, that is on its way to the president's desk, has some good things in it for Ukraine, some rebuffs on what the administration was trying to do. Now I'm anxious to see what Mitch McConnell and the House appropriators put in defense appropriations. Thank you for your time. We do still have questions on the side. I'm going to give my email address, and if people want to send them to me, I will see if we can get answers back to you. My email address is robert@robertamcconnell.com. No punctuation. A is the middle initial. robertamcconnell.com. If you want to write, we'll see if we can get answers to you. Thank you, panelists. It's always good to be with you. I'm sure we'll be in touch regularly going forward, but have a good evening.
Thank you.